Snow drifted past Aspen street lamps like pale ash, muting tires and swallowing sound. Inside the silver bean, warmth pooled in amber light. Steam curled from the old espresso machine, and cinnamon clung to the air. Clara Hayes worked the late shift with the quiet focus of someone who'd learned to move without drawing notice. Sleeves rolled, camera bag tucked beneath the counter, smile small yet sincere. At 10:02 the bell chimed. He arrived as always, tall, neatly kept, charcoal coat, dusted with powder, eyes the color of winter dusk. He ordered decaf, no sugar, and thanked her with a voice low enough to feel rather than hear. He never stayed long, yet he always returned. Clara told herself stories about him the way photographers chase light, little guesses, careful frames, business traveler, ski instructor, a man hiding from a party 2 blocks over. He sat in the corner facing the window where frost branched like rivers on glass, hands wrapped around the cup as if the warmth might anchor him. A thin silver ring hung on a chain beneath his collar. Sometimes he touched it and went very still. Tonight, a gust shouldered the door and flung snow across the tiles. Clara stepped out with a towel, laughing under her breath, and he looked up. For a heartbeat too long, their eyes caught hers, inquisitive, his startled, both retreating like hands from flame. She set a napkin by his saucer. He nodded, almost grateful. Her pulse kept an unsteady tempo. She pretended not to notice. Outside, the gondola lights winked over white slopes, and distant laughter drifted like bells through the brittle air tonight. She thought he was just another stranger seeking warmth on a cold night. What happened next would change everything, and what she'd discover about him would leave her breathless. Clara wiped the last streak of melted snow from the counter, her hands moving in a rhythm learned from years behind coffeehouse bars. The silver bean had become her second skin. Warm wood counters, the constant hiss of steaming milk, shelves lined with old coffee tins, whose labels had faded to soft sepia. Outside, the snow kept falling, a steady curtain that blurred the festive lights strung along Aspen's main street. Inside, she worked through the quiet hours between the dinner rush and closing, when only the regulars or the occasional wanderer came through. She had been in Aspen for nearly 2 years, though she still felt like a visitor. Before that, her world had been Denver College, a cramped apartment, a short-lived engagement that dissolved before the invitations were sent. Photography had been her passion since high school, but the dream had taken a back seat to bills, rent, and the kind of emergencies that always seemed to arrive when she least expected them. The camera in her bag now was the same one she had bought with her first scholarship check. The lens had a scratch, the body a faint dent on the side, but it still captured light like nothing else. It was the only expensive thing she owned outright, and the only thing she refused to pawn when times grew lean. Her shifts at the Silver Bean paid just enough to cover rent on her tiny studio and chip away at the last of her student loans. She told herself this was temporary, that someday soon she'd send a portfolio to a magazine or finally book a gallery slot. For now, she lived one paycheck and one photograph at a time. She was polishing a row of cups when the bell above the door rang again. He entered exactly as before, tall frame outlined in the doorway, coat shoulders dusted white, scarf tucked neatly under his collar. His movements were unhurried, but there was a precision to them, as though every step had been measured. Clara glanced up without meaning to, then looked away quickly, suddenly aware of the faint warmth on her cheeks. "Evening," he said, voice quiet but confident. "Evening," she replied, reaching for the cup she knew he preferred. "The usual?" He gave a slight nod. "Please." She turned to the espresso machine, tamping the grounds with a steady hand. Out of the corner of her eye she saw him choose the same table in the corner, the one with the view of the snow-covered street. She told herself she was imagining the way he seemed to notice everything, the tilt of a chair, the draft near the window, the way the room's light softened when someone stepped in from the cold. She carried the cup to his table, the saucer balanced easily on her palm. As she leaned forward to place it in front of him, a child's laugh from outside startled her. Her elbow brushed the edge of the table, and coffee tipped toward the rim. A dark line spread along the saucer's edge, a few drops splashing onto his sleeve. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," she said, setting the cup down quickly and reaching for the napkin from her apron. "It's fine," he replied, voice low and even, though his gaze flickered to the damp spot. "Really?" Still she dabbed at the fabric, careful not to touch his hand. The wool was warm from his skin, the scent of cedar faint, but unmistakable. "Guess that makes me officially clumsy tonight," she murmured, forcing a light laugh. He smiled faintly, the expression quick but real. "It's hardly the worst thing to happen to me this week." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet weight, as if the words carried more than they revealed. Clara straightened, unsure whether to ask. Instead, she set the napkin beside his saucer. "If you need more, I'll make another." "This is perfect," he said. "Thank you." "Clara," she offered. "Clara Hayes." "Daniel," he replied after a pause, as though deciding whether to share the name. "Daniel Mercer." She repeated it in her head, filing it away like a detail in a photograph. The curve of a letter, the way the syllables set. A pair of tourists entered, shaking snow from their hats, and she excused herself to take their order. But even while steaming milk and scribbling names onto cups, she caught herself glancing toward the corner. Daniel sat with one hand wrapped around the cup, the other resting on the table beside a small leather-bound notebook. He didn't write in it, only turned it slowly between his fingers, as though considering whether to open it at all. When the room quieted again, she noticed his gaze resting not on the street outside, but on her camera bag near the register. The strap's frayed edge had long since lost its black dye, showing the pale fabric beneath. "You're a photographer?" he asked when she returned to clear a table near. "Trying to be," she said, a faint shrug accompanying the words. "Mostly I take pictures for myself these days." "Why mostly?" She hesitated. It wasn't the kind of question most customers asked, and certainly not with that kind of attentive stillness, as though her answer mattered. "Life got in the way, rent, loans, the usual." He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he said. "You should keep at it. You have the eyes for it." She blinked. "How can you tell?" He tilted his head slightly, a ghost of a smile at the edge of his mouth. "Because you see people before they see you, that's rare." The remark lingered in the air long after she walked back to the counter. She wasn't used to being noticed in that way, not just seen, but understood, even in a small, uncertain way. The sensation unsettled her, yet there was warmth in it too. Closing time came slowly that night. The last customers left with murmured thanks. The tables stood empty except for Daniel's. He finished his coffee, set the cup neatly at the center of the saucer, and wrote, "Good night, Clara," he said, as if they had been greeting each other for years. "Good night, Daniel." He stepped into the snow, the bell above the door marking his exit. She watched him pass under the street lamps, his figure blurring into the white haze. As she turned off the lights, she caught her reflection in the glass, hair pulled back loosely, cheeks flushed from the warmth inside, eyes tracing the path he had taken. She wondered if he'd come back tomorrow, and why. She hoped the answer was yes. Sometimes the people we meet by accident turn out to be the ones we were meant to find. Snow had a way of softening Aspen's mornings, muting the clatter of shop doors and the rumble of delivery trucks. For Clara, it meant brushing a dusting of white from the cafe's steps before unlocking the door, the smell of roasted beans already seeping into the chilled air. 3 days had passed since she'd learned Daniel's name. In that time, he had returned each evening without fail, always around the same hour, always ordering the same decaf, no sugar. His presence slipped into the rhythm of her shifts, as naturally as the steady hum of the espresso machine. Some nights they exchanged only a handful of words, a simple greeting, a "how's your day?" Other nights, the quiet stretched comfortably, their conversations weaving between the sound of milk steaming and the clink of porcelain cups. It started with small talk. How the snowpack promised a good ski season, how the mountains looked sharper in winter light. Then slowly, their exchanges grew longer. He asked about her photography, his questions precise but never invasive, the kind that suggested he listened to every answer. One evening, when the rush had passed, and the cafe had settled into a calm hum, Clara sat at the counter flipping through her sketchbook. It was a habit she'd kept since college, scribbles of ideas for photographs, rough outlines of lighting setups, and quick sketches of people she saw during the day. The pages were smudged with pencil and faint coffee rings. Daniel approached quietly, leaning just enough to see the open page. "Is that yours?" She closed it halfway, suddenly self-conscious. "Just rough ideas, nothing finished." His gaze lingered on the corner of a drawing, an older man sitting on a park bench, his coat collar turned up against the wind, eyes lost in thought. The shading was soft, deliberate. "You captured him," Daniel said, as if the man in the sketch were someone he knew, not just how he looked, but what he felt in that moment. Clara gave a slight shrug, unsure how to respond. Praise was something she'd learned to deflect. It never stayed long without expectation. "I just draw what I notice. That's what makes it art," he replied, the faintest curve to his mouth. Before she could answer, the door swung open, letting in a gust of snow and 2 customers. She tucked the sketchbook under the counter and turned to take their order. By the time she returned, Daniel had gone, his table empty save for a folded napkin beneath his empty cup. She almost tossed it into the trash, then noticed the neat handwriting across one corner. "Your eye for detail is rare. Don't hide." The words lodged somewhere deep, stirring a place she hadn't visited in years. It had been a long time since anyone spoke to her creativity as if it mattered. From then on, their exchanges became a quiet thread running through her night. They talked about Aspen's hidden spots, about the way snow changed the color of the mountains, about the scent of pine after a storm. He spoke of books he reread every winter, films he returned to for comfort, though he rarely offered more than a glimpse into his personal life. Clara didn't press. She understood the value of privacy, the safety in leaving some spaces untouched. She told him about her favorite time to shoot, the hour before sunrise, when the world held its breath. He listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on hers with an attentiveness that made her chest tighten. One night he arrived later than usual, snow clinging to the hem of his coat. She was wiping down the counter when he stepped up, removing his gloves with unhurried care. "Rough day?" she asked. He exhaled slowly, almost a laugh. "You could say that." She didn't ask for details, but something in his posture, shoulders drawn, jaw tight, made her pour his coffee before he ordered. He accepted it with a nod, curling his hands around the cup as though drawing heat from it. Clara leaned on the counter. "You ever think about just leaving everything for a while, disappearing for a bit?" He looked at her for a moment, eyes unreadable. "More than I should." She smiled faintly. "I think about it but then I remember my problems would still be here when I got back." His gaze softened, and for the briefest second, the weight in his expression seemed to lift. As the days shortened toward midwinter, Daniel's visits became the part of her shift she anticipated most. The bell would chime, she'd glance up, and there he'd be, dusting snow from his coat, unwinding his scarf, looking for the same seat. There was no rush between them, no push toward anything beyond the space they shared each night. It was enough. Then, one Wednesday, he surprised her. The café was nearly empty when he arrived, and instead of heading for his usual table, he set his cup on the counter where she stood. "You ever think about showing your work?" he asked, nodding toward her camera bag. Clara hesitated. "I used to, not so much anymore." "Why not?" She gave a half smile. "Because it's easier to keep something you love safe if you never risk it." He was quiet for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket. "Humor me," he said, sliding a small envelope toward her. Inside was a card from a local art collective, the kind that hosted seasonal showcases. On the back, in his handwriting, "Sometimes the people we meet by accident turn out to be the ones we were meant to find." Her fingers stilled over the card. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her throat tighten. She wanted to ask why he cared, why he saw something in her worth encouraging. Instead, she slipped the card into her apron pocket. When he left that night, the bell's chime lingered longer than usual, as if the air itself had shifted. She stood at the window after closing, watching the snow catch in the lamplight, wondering how a stranger could make her feel more visible than people she'd known for years. The house stood just beyond Aspen's quieter streets, where snow muffled the world and the mountains loomed like silent sentinels. Daniel eased the front door shut, careful not to wake Jack, who had fallen asleep on the couch waiting for him. The boy's head rested on a sketch pad, half-finished doodles of snowmen and skiers scattered across the page. A fleece blanket had slipped to the floor. Daniel bent to lift it, tucking it under his son's chin before switching off the lamp. Upstairs, Sophie's light still glowed faintly. He paused at her door, knocking softly before stepping inside. She was propped against a stack of pillows, sketchbook open on her lap. A cluster of colored pencils fanned out beside her. Her hair, the same deep chestnut as his, fell forward as she worked. "Shouldn't you be asleep?" he asked gently. "Almost done," she murmured, shading the edge of a snow-covered pine. "It's for art class." He sat at the foot of her bed, watching her hand move in deliberate strokes. She was 11, but her focus carried the weight of someone older, someone who had learned early that details mattered. "That's beautiful," he said, meaning it. "You're getting better every week." She smiled faintly without looking up. "You say that every time." "Because it's true." Her pencil stilled. "You were late again." The observation carried no accusation, only a quiet fact. Still, it caught him. "I had some things to finish." Sophie glanced up, studying him in that sharp, assessing way she'd inherited from her mother. "Yes," he admitted, knowing she'd hear the hesitation. "But I'm here now." She nodded, returning to her drawing. After a moment she said, "Jack wants you to come to his ski practice on Saturday." Daniel felt the pinch of conflict even before she finished. Saturdays were unpredictable. Meetings, unexpected calls, problems that couldn't wait. But he had missed too many already. "I'll be there," he promised, and this time he meant it without reserve. Later in his study, he loosened his tie and sat at the desk. The room was lined with framed photographs, summits conquered, rivers crossed, hikers wearing Mercer Outfitters gear. His company's reach stretched far beyond Aspen now, but the weight of steering it never lessened. Emails crowded his inbox, contracts awaited signatures, and tomorrow's board meeting loomed like a storm front. To most, Daniel Mercer was the man at the top, a CEO with the kind of life people imagined was flawless. They didn't see the empty half of the bed, the juggling act between quarterly reports and science projects, or the quiet moments when the house felt too large for 3 people. He leaned back, rubbing his temple. Running Mercer Outfitters had been his father's dream, one he'd inherited after years of learning every layer of the business. Since his wife Emily had passed, it had also been his shield, something to throw himself into when grief threatened to pull him under. Yet lately, the shield felt heavier than the loss it was meant to guard against. In the stillness, his thoughts wandered to the silver bean, to the quiet hum of conversation, the earthy scent of fresh grounds, the way Clara's eyes lit when she spoke about photography. She never asked who he was beyond his first name. She didn't look at him like a headline or a bank account, only as a person standing across the counter. It was both disarming and necessary. Jack's small footsteps padded into the study. His hair was mussed from sleep, his eyes half closed. "You forgot to check my homework," he mumbled. Daniel smiled faintly, closing his laptop. "Let's do it now." They sat together at the desk, Jack's workbook between them. The boy's questions came rapid fire, curiosity spilling faster than the pencil could keep up. When they finished, Jack leaned against him, the weight a quiet reminder that no title in the world mattered more than Dad. After tucking him back in, Daniel returned to his desk but left the laptop closed. He pulled the leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket, the same one Clara had seen. Flipping it open, he found a fresh page and wrote, "Remember to ask about her favorite camera." It was a small thing, but it anchored him to something beyond balance sheets and quarterly projection. The next morning came before the night had fully released its hold. Breakfast was a blur of cereal bowls, misplaced gloves and last-minute permission slips. Sophie reminded him again about Jack's practice, her gaze steady as if daring him to forget. He kissed their foreheads, sent them off with the driver, and stepped into the waiting car for the office. The day unfolded in meetings, each one demanding decisions that felt both urgent and unending. By the time the sun dipped low behind the mountains, he was drained. Yet instead of heading straight home, he found himself walking toward the silver bean, snow crunching beneath his shoes. Inside, Clara stood behind the counter, steam curling from the machine. She glanced up, a smile flickering in recognition, and for the first time all day the tension in his shoulders eased. As he sat with his cup, he thought of how little she knew about him, and how much she'd seen without realizing. There was a quiet safety in that anonymity, a reprieve from being Daniel Mercer, CEO, and simply being a man who came in from the cold for coffee. He stayed longer than usual, listening to the murmur of other patrons, the clink of cups, the faint strains of music from the speaker. When he finally left, the night air felt sharper, but lighter too. Back home, after the children were asleep, he stood at the window of his study, watching the snow gather on the pines. The house was silent, except for the hum of the furnace. In the glass, his reflection looked like someone he almost recognized. Part businessman, part father, part man unsure which role needed him most. He thought again of Sophie's drawing, of Jack's laughter, of Clara's quiet encouragement when she didn't even know she'd given. Maybe, he realized, the life he'd built looked complete from the outside, but inside it was still waiting for something or someone to make it whole. Sometimes the ones who seem to have it all are the ones who need saving the most. The morning rush at the Silver Bean came in waves, skiers grabbing lattes before the lifts opened, locals stopping for Americanos on their way to work, the occasional tourist lingering to photograph the cafe's rustic beams. Clara moved quickly, her motions precise from years of habit, the air warm and thick with the scent of espresso. By mid-morning the crowd had thinned to a few tables. She leaned against the counter, sipping her coffee between tasks. A stack of magazines left by a customer sat near the pastry case, their glossy covers catching the light. She reached for the top one, a winter lifestyle issue showcasing Aspen's luxury homes and ski resorts. Flipping through, her eyes paused on a 2-page spread. The headline read, "Mercer Outfitters expands global reach." The photo was unmistakable. Daniel, dressed in a dark suit, standing against a backdrop of snow-capped peaks. The shot captured the same quiet composure she'd seen across the counter night after night, but here it carried an undeniable authority. Below, the caption identified him as Daniel Mercer, CEO of Mercer Outfitters, a multi-million-dollar outdoor brand. Her fingers tightened around the pages. The words blurred slightly as her mind processed them. CEO, multi-million-dollar global reach. She had imagined many possibilities about his life, but none had come close to this. The man who drank decaf in the corner, who noticed her sketches, who left notes on napkins, was a millionaire whose name appeared in print. A strange mix of emotions swelled: admiration for his accomplishments, confusion over why he'd never mentioned it, and an uneasy weight of insecurity. She thought of her tiny studio apartment, her scratched camera, and the overdraft notices she kept in a drawer. In his world, did people like her even register? The bell above the door chimed, jolting her from the page. Daniel stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. His gaze found hers almost immediately, but something in her expression must have shifted, because he slowed as he approached. "Morning," he said, his tone gentle. She set the magazine down, the cover facing away from him. "Morning. You okay?" he asked, searching her face. She hesitated, then slid the magazine toward him, the page still open to his photograph. "I guess I should be saying congratulations." His eyes flickered to the image, then back to her. He didn't flinch, but there was a pause before he spoke. "I was going to tell you." "When?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. He rested his hands on the counter. "When it felt like you knew me before you knew that." Clara exhaled, uncertain whether to laugh or retreat. I don't understand why you wouldn't say something." "Because I've learned that once people know, everything changes," he said, the edge of weariness in his voice. "The way they look at you, what they expect from you, it's not real anymore. And I didn't want that with you." She glanced down, tracing the rim of her cup with her finger. "It's just a lot to take in. You live in a completely different world." Daniel's expression softened. "Not as different as you think." Her skepticism must have shown, because he added quietly, "Let me tell you something I don't talk about." He waited until the cafe was empty before continuing. 5 years ago, my wife Emily died in a car accident. Sophie was 6, Jack was 2. I had a company to run, 2 kids who needed me, and no idea how to be both things at once. For a while I hid in the work because it was easier than facing the space at home. Clara's chest tightened. She'd seen grief before in her father after her mother left. In the mirror during the years she'd stopped picking up her camera. I started going to the Silver Bean last winter, he said, his gaze steady on hers. At first it was just somewhere quiet. But then there was you, someone who looked me in the eye without expecting anything. You didn't care about my title. You saw me, not the sea. Her throat felt tight, the mix of insecurity and admiration shifting into something more complex. You could have trusted me with that sooner. I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid you'd pull away before I had the chance to know you. She looked at him for a long moment, the hum of the espresso machine filling the space between them. I don't know what to do with this, she said honestly. Then don't do anything yet, he replied. Just keep talking to me the way you always have. They stood there, the snow outside drifting in slow spirals past the window, the weight of the reveal settling between them. Part of her wanted to retreat, to put distance between their worlds before she got lost in him. Another part, the one that remembered his notes, his quiet encouragement, the way he listened, wanted to stay right where she was. When the next customer entered, Clara stepped back, slipping into the familiar motions of her work. Daniel took his usual seat, though she caught him watching her with an expression that was less guarded now, as if letting her in had lifted something from his shoulders. Later, as he left, he paused at the door. Clara, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. I'm still the same man who comes here for coffee. That hasn't changed. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed it yet. As the door closed behind him, she touched the edge of the magazine again, the glossy page cool beneath her finger. Outside, the mountains stood unchanged, their peaks catching the pale winter light. Inside, her world felt slightly tilted, as if she'd stepped into a photograph where the subject had shifted, but the frame remained the same. The invitation arrived, tucked inside a simple white envelope, Daniel's handwriting on the front. Clara found it on the cafe counter after her shift, slid between the stack of receipts she'd been sorting. Mercer Outfitters, Winter Charity Gala, Aspen Community Center. Beneath the printed details, a note in his careful script read, "Would you come? It would mean a lot to me and them." She turned the card over in her hands, the gold embossed lettering catching the light. A gala was worlds away from her usual Saturday nights spent editing photos or brewing late coffee for the last few customers. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the thought of stepping into Daniel's public world, or the hint that them meant his children. By the time she arrived, the community center had transformed into something out of a winter dream. Twinkling lights hung from the rafters, white and gold tablecloths covered long banquet tables, and evergreen garlands wound around the stage's wooden posts. Through the large windows, the snow outside reflected the warm glow from within, blurring the line between the frozen night and the bustling room. Daniel greeted her near the entrance, his suit a deep navy that made his eyes look darker. "You came," he said, and there was something in his voice, relief, maybe, that steadied her nerves. "I wasn't sure what to wear," she admitted, glancing down at the simple black dress she'd pulled from the back of her closet. "You look perfect," he said without hesitation, and though she knew it was a safe answer, the sincerity in his tone caught her off guard. Before she could reply, two figures appeared at his side. Sophie stood a step behind him, dressed in a soft blue sweater dress, her hair pulled back neatly. Jack, in a miniature version of his father's suit, clutched a small model airplane. "This is Clara," Daniel said, looking at them with a gentle encouragement that spoke volumes about how much he wanted this moment to go well. Sophie offered a polite, "Hi," her voice quiet but not unfriendly. Jack grinned openly. "Dad says you make the best coffee in Aspen." Clara laughed softly. "That's a big compliment. I'll have to make one for you sometime." The evening unfolded in small pockets of conversation and introduction. Daniel moved between guests with practiced ease, thanking donors, answering questions, always attentive but never distant. Clara stayed close to Sophie and Jack, finding herself drawn into their orbit. Near the back of the hall, a display table held silent auction items, paintings from local artists, handcrafted quilts, ski passes, and photography prints. Sophie lingered over the photographs, her fingers hovering above the frames without touching. "Do you like taking pictures?" Clara asked. Sophie nodded slowly. I draw more than I take photos, but I like looking at them. They feel real but also like a story. Clara smiled. That's exactly how I see them too. Want to try taking some tonight? Sophie's eyes widened slightly. Here. Why not? Clara pulled her camera from her bag, adjusting the strap so it fit over Sophie's shoulder. First rule, don't worry about getting it perfect. Just look for something that makes you want to remember this moment. They wandered through the hall together, Sophie pausing to snap shots of the dessert table, the garlands, even Jack mid-laugh as he tried to balance his airplane on the edge of a chair. Clara showed her how to adjust the focus, how to use the light from the chandeliers to soften shadow. You're good at explaining things, Sophie said, reviewing the images on the screen. You're good at seeing things, Clara replied. That's harder to teach. Later Daniel found them by the refreshment table. Sophie handed him the camera, pointing to a photo of Jack holding the model airplane high above his head, his grin wide enough to eclipse the background. That's incredible, Daniel said, genuine pride in his voice. You took. Sophie nodded, and for a moment, her usual reserve melted into a shy smile. The rest of the evening moved quickly. There were speeches, a raffle, and more mingling. Clara found herself watching Daniel with his children, how he knelt to hear Jack's stories, how he rested a hand on Sophie's shoulder when she spoke to adults she didn't know. The man she'd first met in the quiet corner of a café was still here, but now she saw the layers he carried. Father, leader, someone trying to keep both worlds from colliding too hard. When the crowd began to thin, Daniel walked her to the coat check. Thank you, he said quietly, for coming. For them. They're great kids, she said, meaning it. Sophie has a good eye. You should encourage her with photography. I think she'd like that, especially if you're the one teaching her. Outside, the snow was falling again, softer now, blanketing the street in silence. Sophie and Jack waited by the car, Sophie clutching a small envelope from the raffle, and Jack waving his airplane in the cold air. Good night, Clara, Sophie said, and though the words were simple, there was a warmth in them that hadn't been there when they first met. Jack added, see you at the café, before climbing into the car. Daniel lingered a moment longer. You've given them something tonight. More than you know. Clara shook her head. All I did was let Sophie take some pictures. That's not all, he said. You showed her she can tell a story her way. That mattered. As she walked home, the crisp air stung her cheeks, but the cold couldn't touch the quiet glow she carried from the evening. She thought of Sophie's concentration behind the lens, Jack's unfiltered laughter, and the way Daniel's eyes softened when he looked at them. She had stepped into his world for a night, and found pieces of herself she hadn't realized were missing. Sometimes family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up when you need them most. The following week began quietly enough. The cafe bustled with its usual rhythm, Daniel's visits slipping back into the comfortable cadence they had found before the gala. Clara still thought about that night, the way Sophie's shyness had lifted when she held the camera, the easy warmth of Jack's grin. But those thoughts carried a steady glow rather than the bright rush they'd been. On Thursday afternoon, she was wiping down tables during a lull when the bell over the door rang. It was Marlene, a local painter, who'd been part of Aspen's art scene for decades. She carried a rolled flyer in one hand, and her usual herbal tea in the other. You're famous, Marlene said, unrolling the paper across the counter. Well, almost, Clara frowned, leaning closer. It was a promotional poster for the upcoming Aspen Winter Art Showcase. Alongside the list of featured artists was her name, and below it, a photograph she'd taken years ago, one she'd never shown publicly. A solitary figure on a snowy pier, back turned, coat snapping in the wind. Her pulse kicked. This can't be right. I didn't submit anything. Marlene looked surprised. Then someone did it for you. Whoever it was must think highly of your work. Clara's mind sifted through possibilities, but only one made sense. The memory of Daniel's quiet encouragement, his way of steering without forcing, suddenly felt different, calculated. She thanked Marlene, set the flyer aside, and tried to focus on the following order, but her hands moved on autopilot. When Daniel arrived that evening, the air between them felt off before a word was spoken. She poured his usual coffee without meeting his eyes, sliding it across the counter with a practiced motion. "Long day?" he asked. "You could say that," she replied, reaching for the flyer and placing it in front of him. "Care to explain that?" He glanced down, recognition flickering instantly. "You weren't supposed to see it like this. So you did submit it?" "Yes," he said, steady but cautious. "I thought you'd make decisions about my work without even asking." He set the cup aside. "I thought you needed a chance. I've seen what you can do, Clara. This is an opportunity. It's my opportunity to decide on," she cut in, the sharpness in her voice surprising even herself. "You don't get to just put me out there because you think it's good for me." He leaned forward, his tone measured. "I wasn't trying to control anything. I wanted to help. That's the thing," she said, her chest tight. "You don't get to decide I need help. You don't know what it's like to have people step in thinking they're fixing your life when all they're doing is reminding you you couldn't do it yourself." The silence that followed was heavy. Daniel's gaze didn't waver, but something in his posture shifted, as though her words had landed in a place he hadn't braced for. "I know more about that feeling than you think," he said finally, "but I'm not going to pretend I didn't cross a line." Clara folded the flyer, sliding it back across the counter. "I can't do this right now." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and left without finishing his coffee. The bell above the door sounded sharper than usual, the cold air lingering in his absence. For the next several days she avoided the café during his usual hour, swapping shifts when she could. It wasn't anger that kept her away so much as the sting of old wounds reopened. Years ago, after her mother left, her father had filled every gap with decisions she hadn't asked for. School changes, job rejections, even selling the first camera she'd ever bought. Each time someone acted for her instead of with her, it chipped away at the belief that she could steer her own life. Now, even with Daniel's intentions, the pattern felt too familiar. Daniel, for his part, respected her absence, but felt the space like an unbalanced weight. At home, Sophie asked why Clara hadn't visited since the gala. Jack wondered if she was busy taking more photos. Daniel didn't have the answers he wanted to give. One night, after the children were asleep, he sat in his study staring at the framed photographs on the wall. He'd built his company by seeing potential where others didn't, by taking risks when hesitation would have meant loss. But in his personal life, that instinct seemed to misfire. With Clara, he'd thought the gesture would speak as clearly as words. Instead, it had built a wall he didn't know how to climb. He considered calling, then decided against it. Words in the wrong order could push her further away. Instead, he drafted a short note, scratching out the first 2 attempts before settling on, "I acted without asking. I'm sorry. You deserved the choice. If you decide to walk away, I'll respect it, but I hope you don't." He left the note in an envelope at the cafe counter the next morning before opening hours. Clara found it when she arrived, her name written in his familiar hand. She read it twice, then tucked it into her apron pocket, without deciding whether to respond. The showcase loomed closer. Marlene mentioned that her photograph had been placed in a prominent spot in the exhibit. Clara thought about pulling out, about calling the coordinator and explaining the mistake, but some quiet, stubborn part of her hesitated. Not because of Daniel, but because the image meant something to her. It had been taken on a day when she'd felt invisible, and had still found beauty worth capturing. Even so, she kept her distance. The nights felt longer without the steady comfort of his visits, the absence apparent in the unclaimed table in the corner. She tried to tell herself it was better this way, that keeping her world small was safer, but safety, she realized, had never brought her closer to the life she wanted. Still, the sting of being decided lingered, the echo of old habits hard to silence. Snow fell thick and steady the night Clara's phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Clara, it's Sophie." The girl's voice was quiet, wavering. "Dad said you're probably busy. But Jack's sick. He's been in bed all day, and I have a school project due tomorrow. I don't know how to finish it alone." Clara set down the dish she'd been washing. "Where's your dad now?" "In his office on a call. He said he'd help after. But it's already late." There was no hesitation in Clara's reply. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. She bundled into her coat, grabbed her camera bag out of habit, and stepped into the cold, The drive through Aspen's quiet streets felt shorter than usual, headlights cutting through the heavy flakes. When she reached the Mercer house, Sophie was waiting at the door, hair pulled back, a notebook clutched in her hands. "Thank you for coming," she said, relief softening her features. "Of course. Where's Jack?" "In his room. He has a fever, but Dad says it's just the flu." Clara followed her upstairs, pausing to peek into the dimly lit bedroom, where Jack lay curled under the blankets. His cheeks were flushed, his hair damp with sweat. She brushed a hand lightly across his forehead. "Hey buddy, how are you feeling?" "Like my head's a snowball," he mumbled, eyes half closed. She smiled gently. "Get some rest. Sophie and I will take care of the project." In the kitchen they spread out Sophie's materials on the long table, colored pencils, construction paper, printout. The assignment was a diorama of a winter habitat, and Sophie had sketched out a scene with pine trees, a frozen pond, and fox tracks in the snow. "You've got a great start," Clara said, picking up a pencil. "Want to show me how you planned the rest?" As they worked side by side, Sophie's initial shyness faded. She spoke about her favorite classes, about a book she was reading, about how she sometimes drew in the margins of her math homework when no one was looking. Clara showed her how to use shading to make the snow look layered, how to angle the trees so the scene felt alive. Half an hour in, footsteps sounded from the hall. Daniel appeared, still in a dress shirt, sleeves rolled, tie loose around his neck. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen, his gaze taking in the two of them bent over the project. "I didn't expect you tonight," he said quietly. Clara straightened, feeling the weight of the weeks between them. Sophie called. "I couldn't say no." He nodded slowly. "Thank you for helping her, for coming." Sophie looked between them, sensing the undercurrent but not naming it. "We're almost done," she said brightly. Daniel crossed the room and rested a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Looks great. I'll check on Jack again." When he returned, Sophie was rinsing paintbrushes at the sink. "He's asleep," Daniel said. "Fever's a little lower." "That's good," Clara replied, focusing on trimming a piece of paper. He pulled out a chair opposite her. "I owe you an apology, a bigger one than I left at the café." She set the scissors down, meeting his eyes for the first time that night. "I thought I was helping," he said, "but what I did was take control of something that wasn't mine to touch. I know how it feels to have decisions made for you. I've lived with that too." I should have remembered it before acting. The anger she'd carried had cooled over the days, but the hurt had lingered. "It's not just the gallery," she said. "It's that you didn't trust me enough to make my own choice. I've had people decide my life for me before, and it doesn't end well." "I understand," he said quietly. "The truth is, I was scared you'd say no, not because your work isn't good enough, it's extraordinary, but because you'd think you weren't ready. And I didn't want the world to miss seeing what I see." His words settled in the space between them, neither rushed nor pleading. Clara exhaled. "You're right. I probably would have said no, but that has to be my mistake to make, not yours to protect me from." "I hear you," he said, "and I don't want to be another person who takes that away from you." They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of water running in the sink, and Sophie humming under her breath filling the room. "I missed seeing you at the café," Daniel admitted. "More than I expected." "I missed it too," she said, the admission soft but honest. Something eased in his expression then, like a door opening. Sophie returned, holding up the finished diorama. "What do you think?" Clara smiled. "I think your teacher's going to love it." Daniel's gaze lingered on his daughter's work, but his voice was for Clara. "She couldn't have done it without you tonight." Clara shook her head. "She could have, she just needed someone to sit with her while she did." After Sophie went upstairs to pack her bag for the morning, Daniel walked Clara to the door. The snow outside had piled into soft drifts along the porch. "Thank you," he said again, his tone quieter now, more personal. "Not just for tonight, for not staying away forever." She studied him for a moment, seeing the strain of the past weeks, the guardedness that had begun to crack. "We both built walls," she said. "Maybe it's time we start taking them down." His breath clouded in the cold air. "The hardest walls to break are the ones we build around our hearts." They stood there a moment longer, snow falling between them, like a promise, yet to be spoken. Then she stepped into the night, the warmth of the Mercer house following her all the way home. The gallery smelled faintly of varnish and fresh paint. the walls lined with frames that caught the light in warm glints. Clara stood near the entrance, fingers curled loosely around the strap of her bag, willing her pulse to slow. She'd been to openings before, but never her own, not with her name printed on the program, not with her work lit under spotlights for strangers to examine. Her photograph, the one Daniel had submitted, hung near the center of the room. Around it, the rest of her series formed a quiet narrative: snow-covered streets, solitary benches, moments where light caught in glass, just long enough to be remembered. Each image had a story, pieces of her life hidden in the shadows and lines. She was speaking with the gallery director when the doors opened, letting in a swirl of cold air. Daniel entered first, Sophie and Jack close behind. He wasn't in a suit tonight, just a dark coat, a scarf looped loosely around his neck. But somehow the room shifted when he walked in. Sophie clutched a small folder against her chest, her eyes bright. Jack carried a bouquet wrapped in silver paper. "You made it," Clara said as they reached her. "Wouldn't miss it," Daniel replied, his voice steady but threaded with something softer. He turned to the children. "Go on." Jack held out the bouquet. "Dad says flowers are for important stuff." Clara smiled, bending to take them. "This counts." Sophie passed her the folder. "These are my pictures from the festival last week. You can keep them." The gesture tightened Clara's throat. "I'd be honored." As the evening moved forward, Daniel stayed nearby but let her navigate the conversations. He watched as she spoke with visitors, explaining her process, listening to their interpretation. Each time he caught her eye across the room, there was a shared understanding. This was hers, and he was here to witness it. Near the end of the night, the director tapped a glass for attention. "Before we close, I'd like to thank all our artists. Tonight's showcase has been one of our most attended winter events, and that's due in no small part to the talent in this room. One piece in particular has drawn quite a response." Clara's breath caught as the director gestured toward her work. Applause filled the space, warm and unforced. Daniel stepped forward then, resting a hand lightly on her back, and said clearly enough for those nearby to hear, "This is my family." It was simple, unadorned, but the word lodged in her chest like an anchor. Family. Not just his children, not just the household she'd glimpsed her to. Later, after the gallery emptied, and the last of the snow was swept from the entry, they stepped outside into Aspen's winter festival. The streets glowed under strings of lights, shop windows framed with garlands, music drifting from a stage in the square. Vendors sold hot cider and roasted chestnuts, the air alive with the sound of laughter and the crunch of boots on packed snow. They walked together toward the center of the square, where the largest tree in town stood draped in white and gold lights. Sophie skipped ahead to join friends near a cocoa stand, Jack darting after her. Clara slowed, the glow from the lights catching in her hair. Daniel stopped beside her. "You know," he said, "I've been trying to find the right time for something." She turned, brow lifted. "And now's the time. If I wait any longer I'll just find another excuse," he said, the corner of his mouth curving. The crowd noise faded into the background. He took her hands, the warmth of his grip grounding her against the cold. "I came into that cafe last winter because it was quiet. I stayed because you were there. You didn't treat me like a name in a magazine, or a man who'd lost too much to talk about. You treated me like someone worth knowing." Her breath clouded between them, but she didn't move away. "I'm in love with you, Clara," he said. "Not because you fit into my life, but because you've changed the way I see it. You've given Sophie and Jack something I couldn't. You've given me something I didn't think I'd find again." The tree's lights reflected in her eyes as she answered, "I don't know what the future looks like, Daniel, but I know I want to find out with you." He smiled then, the kind that reached his eyes, and pulled her into a kiss that felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. Around them, the festival carried on. Music, laughter, snow still falling, but for a moment, the world narrowed to the warmth between them. A week later, Clara found herself back at the community center, this time for a different kind of event. The stage was set with a banner that read "Sophie's Light, an art foundation for young creators." Tables around the room displayed artwork from local children, drawings, photographs, collages, all part of the foundation's first showcase. Daniel had told her the idea came from Sophie herself, inspired by the night at the gala when she'd first held Clara's camera. The foundation would provide supplies, mentorship, and exhibition opportunities for young artists in the community. When it was Sophie's turn to speak, she stood at the podium, her voice small at first but steadying as she went. "Art makes you see things differently," she said. "It makes you notice what you might miss. I want other kids to have that chance." Applause filled the room, but Clara's attention stayed on Daniel, who was watching his daughter with a pride that softened every line of his face. He caught Clara's gaze across the tables, and in that moment, she felt the truth of what he'd said at the gallery. This was family, not built in the usual way, but built all the same. As the evening wound down, Jack tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Dad says we should go get cocoa at the festival before it closes." She laughed. "That sounds perfect." They stepped back into the crisp night air, the lights of Aspen twinkling above the snow. Daniel walked beside her, their hands brushing until they stayed together. Sophie and Jack ran ahead, their laughter carrying through the street. For the first time in years, Clara didn't feel like she was watching life from behind a lens. She was in the frame now, part of the picture, and it was exactly where she wanted to be. If Clara and Daniel's journey reminded you of the power of second chances, subscribe for more stories that warm the heart and renew your faith in love, because sometimes love finds us when we least expect it, but exactly when we need it most.